What happens when the mightiest empire on earth, an army that had never known defeat, suddenly falls in a single day? The Battle of Ain Jalut wasn't just a clash of swords. It was a reminder, echoing scripture itself, that no power stands forever except the power of God. What happens when the mightiest empire on earth, an army that had never known defeat, suddenly falls in a single day? The Battle of Ain Jalut wasn't just a clash of swords. It was a reminder, echoing scripture itself, that no power stands forever except the power of God. We'll explore how the Battle of Ain Jalut reshaped history, why it mattered for the church and for civilization, and how its lessons still speak to us today about perseverance, leadership, and trusting in God when the odds seem impossible. 1. The shadow of the Mongol Empire. The Mongol Empire of the 13th century seemed unstoppable. From the steppes of Asia, their armies thundered across continents, leaving behind cities reduced to ashes and rivers stained with blood. They had already shattered Baghdad, once the jewel of learning and culture, and they pressed relentlessly toward Cairo and the Mediterranean world. No kingdom, no fortress, no city seemed strong enough to resist their storm. For decades, they had never lost a battle. To ordinary people of the time, it must have felt as if an apocalyptic force had been unleashed, destined to swallow the earth. But history reminds us that no power is truly eternal. Psalm 46 declares, "God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble." Human might, no matter how terrifying, is always limited by the hand of the Creator. The Mongols believed their expansion was unstoppable, even divinely favored. Yet in truth, their empire was still only a breath compared to the eternal reign of God. For Catholics, this lesson is vital. We live in a world where powers rise that seem overwhelming. Political systems, cultural movements, technologies, even fears that spread like fire. It can feel as if nothing can resist them. But the story of Ain Jalut, like scripture, reminds us that only God's kingdom endures. What seems unshakable can crumble in a single day when God wills it. The Mongols ruled by fear, convincing entire nations to surrender before a single arrow was shot. But the Lord does not rule through terror. He rules through truth, love, and justice. When we place our trust in Him, even the most terrifying giants lose their power. History's empires fade, but faith stands forever. 2. The Mamluks. From slaves to soldiers of faith. If the Mongols embodied fear, the Mamluks embodied resilience. These men were not born into power. Most were taken as boys, torn from their families in distant lands, sold into slavery, and thrust into a life they did not choose. Yet what began as tragedy became transformation. And through years of brutal training, discipline, and education, these boys were shaped into elite warriors. They learned to fight with swords, spears, and bows, but they also studied strategy, languages, and the Quran. By the time they were freed, they were no longer captives. They were brothers, bound together in loyalty not to a tribe or bloodline, but to each other and to their faith. Scripture reminds us of a similar truth. Galatians chapter 5:1 proclaims, "For freedom Christ has set us free." What was once slavery can become a path to liberation when God redeems it. The Mamluks bore the scars of their past, but those scars became the steel of their strength. Out of humiliation came courage. Out of bondage came unity. Spiritually, their story points to how God often raises up the lowly to confront the mighty. Just as David, a shepherd boy, stood against Goliath, so too these once enslaved men would stand against the greatest army the world had known. Their identity was forged not in privilege, but in perseverance. For Catholics today, this is a reminder that our wounds, weaknesses, and broken histories need not define us. When surrendered to God, even the darkest chapters of our lives can be redeemed into instruments of strength. Just as the Mamluks transformed slavery into solidarity, we are called to allow Christ to turn our brokenness into witness. In God's providence, no suffering is wasted. 3. Qutuz's Defiance and Baibars' strategy. When the Mongols sent their ultimatum to Cairo, demanding surrender or annihilation, most rulers of the age would have trembled. They knew the fate of Baghdad, burned, its libraries drowned in ink, its people slaughtered by the thousands. But Sultan Qutuz did something no one expected. Instead of yielding, he executed the Mongol envoys and displayed their heads on Cairo's gates. It was an act of defiance that made war inevitable, but it also galvanized his people. Sometimes faith requires not compromise, but courage. Scripture echoes this spirit in Acts chapter 5:29. We must obey God rather than men. Qutuz refused to bow before terror. His decision reminds us that true leadership is not about survival at any cost, but about standing firm for what is right, even when the cost is high. Yet courage alone does not win battles. It must be paired with wisdom. Enter Baibars, Qutuz's brilliant general. He had studied the Mongols carefully, noting their tactics and rhythm of attack. He realized they always sent a vanguard to lure the enemy into panic before the main force struck. So, Baibars proposed using the Mongols' own method against them. He would stage a retreat, baiting them into a narrow valley where Mamluk forces lay hidden. This strategy was daring, almost reckless, but it showed the power of discernment. Just as Christ counseled his disciples to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves, Matthew 10:16, Baibars combined insight with discipline to turn the tide of history. For Catholics today, the lesson is clear. In our spiritual battles, we cannot simply resist passively. We must be both courageous and discerning. We must recognize the enemy's patterns, fear, lies, temptation, and counter them with prayer, truth, and wisdom. Faith without strategy falters. Faith with discernment prevails. 4. The Trap at Ain Jalut. The morning of September 3, 1260 dawned over the valley of Ain Jalut. The Mongols approached with confidence. For decades, their reputation had been unmatched. No city had withstood them, no army had prevailed. As their scouts surged ahead, they saw a small group of Mamluk cavalry waiting in the open. To the Mongols, it looked like yet another easy victory. They charged. But this was no ordinary retreat. Baibars had carefully choreographed every move. The Mamluks withdrew slowly, firing arrows as they went, drawing the Mongols deeper into the narrow valley. The walls closed in, the path grew tighter, and still the Mongols pressed forward, certain their pattern would once again bring triumph. They had no idea they were walking into the jaws of an ambush. Then the horns sounded. From the ridges above, thousands of hidden Mamluk soldiers rose from their positions. Arrows rained down. Cavalry charged from both flanks. For the first time in 60 years, a Mongol army was trapped. The scene echoes the story of Gideon in Judges 7, when a small, faithful force defeated a mighty enemy not by strength alone, but by God's plan and clever tactics. The spiritual lesson is profound. Victory does not always belong to the largest army or the strongest empire. It belongs to those who combine courage with faith and wisdom. For us today, the trap at Ain Jalut teaches that even the most intimidating forces, whether cultural pressures, personal trials, or spiritual attacks, can be confronted with the right strategy. God does not call us to fight recklessly, but with prayerful discernment. Just as the Mamluks used intelligence and unity to overcome the unbeatable, we are invited to face life's battles with both faith and prudence, trusting God to guide the outcome. 5. The Sultan Leads from the front. As the clash raged in the valley, the Mongols fought with their trademark ferocity. They pushed, clawed, and carved their way through Mamluk lines, trying desperately to escape the trap. For a moment it seemed they might succeed. Their arrows struck true, their horses thundered with unmatched speed, and their reputation for invincibility still carried weight in every charge. The Mamluks wavered. At that decisive moment, Sultan Qutuz did something that changed the battle forever. He removed his helmet, threw it to the ground, and shouted with all his strength, "For God! For our faith!" His cry echoed through the valley, carried on the wind, piercing the hearts of his warriors. They saw their leader not as a distant figure hiding behind walls, but as one of them, bleeding, fighting, risking his very life. The effect was electric. The soldiers surged forward with renewed fury, no longer fearing death. They knew their sultan stood shoulder to shoulder with them. This is what true leadership looks like, not command from safety, but sacrifice in the storm. The Gospel of John offers a powerful parallel. The Good Shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. John 10:11. Qutuz embodied that truth, leading not by words alone, but by example. His presence transformed despair into courage, hesitation into strength. For us today, this moment challenges leaders of every kind: parents, priests, teachers, community guides. Leadership is not about power or privilege. It is about presence and sacrifice. To lead from the front means sharing the struggles of those we guide, showing that faith is not just preached, but lived. When others see us walk faithfully through trials, they too find courage. Qutuz's cry still speaks. True leaders inspire by laying down themselves. 6. The fall of Kitbuqa and the shattering of the myth. The Mongols had never tasted defeat. For decades, their reputation was terror itself, an unstoppable force that rolled across nations like a storm. But at Ain Jalut, history took a turn. Their general, Kitbuqa, was no ordinary man. Fierce, loyal, and fearless, he fought like a lion in the center of the chaos. His sword cut down opponents, his voice rallied his men, and his presence alone kept the army from collapsing too soon. Yet no warrior, no matter how strong, can stand forever when God has written another ending. Surrounded and overwhelmed, Kitbuqa refused to yield. With his final breath, he shouted defiance. He died not in cowardice, but in the pride of a general who believed himself invincible. But his fall marked the breaking of the Mongol myth. For the first time in 60 years, the empire's aura of invincibility crumbled in the dust of a valley. Here, Scripture offers us a clear mirror. The story of David and Goliath in 1 Samuel 17. Goliath stood as the giant no one could defeat, mocking the armies of Israel. Yet, with faith and courage, the young shepherd struck him down, proving that no enemy is greater than God's will. Kitbuqa was a Goliath of his age, towering in might, yet felled when God allowed the tide to turn. For Catholics today, the lesson is timeless. Every age has its giants: addiction, injustice, fear, or despair that seem unbeatable. Yet, like David, we are called to trust not in our own strength but in the Lord's. Grace, perseverance, and faith can topple even the most terrifying powers. Ain Jalut reminds us that no empire, no sin, no darkness is beyond God's reach. When giants fall, hope rises. 7. Legacy. Why Ain Jalut still matters. When the dust settled at Ain Jalut, something greater than a battle had been won. The Mongol war machine, feared as unstoppable, was halted for the very first time. News of their defeat spread like wildfire, igniting hope from Cairo to Europe. The myth of invincibility was broken. For the world, it meant survival. For the church and civilization, it meant time to preserve knowledge, to rebuild, and to prepare for the centuries ahead. The Mamluks, once enslaved boys turned into warriors, would rule Egypt and Syria for generations. They became protectors of culture, supporting art, science, and faith. Cairo blossomed into one of the richest cities of the medieval world. And the knowledge they preserved, mathematics, medicine, philosophy, would later nourish the European Renaissance. Had Ain Jalut been lost, much of this future might have vanished in fire and blood. For Catholics, the legacy carries deep meaning. Romans 8:31 reminds us, "If God is for us, who can be against us?" The hand of Providence moves through history, not always in ways we expect, but always with purpose. God used unlikely heroes, once slaves, outnumbered soldiers, to safeguard lands and cultures that would one day enrich the wider world, including the Christian West. Spiritually, Ain Jalut teaches us that God works through human courage and sacrifice to preserve his plan. Just as the Mamluks' fidelity shaped history, our fidelity today, whether in families, parishes, or communities, shapes tomorrow. The sacrifices we make for faith ripple outward far beyond what we can see. Ain Jalut is more than a battlefield. It is a reminder that no empire lasts forever, but God's kingdom endures. And when ordinary people trust in him, history itself can be rewritten. Conclusion. In 1260, at Ain Jalut, the tide of history turned. The Mongols, who had never known defeat, were stopped by men who once had no freedom, Mamluk warriors bound by faith, courage, and unity. Under Qutuz and Baibars, they shattered the myth of invincibility and safeguarded civilizations that might have vanished. For Catholics, this is more than history. It is testimony to God's providence that no matter how powerful an empire seems, it cannot stand against his will. Ain Jalut preserved cultures, knowledge, and the very idea that with faith and courage, the impossible can become possible. This battle is more than swords and horses. It is a parable written in blood and sand. The Mamluks remind us that God often lifts the lowly to confound the mighty. Qutuz shows us that true leadership means sacrifice, not comfort. And the fall of the Mongols reminds us that no giant, political, cultural, or spiritual, lasts forever. Only God's kingdom endures. As Catholics today, we face different battles: cultural confusion, moral compromise, personal struggles. Ain Jalut reminds us that we are not powerless. With faith, prayer, and courage, even the strongest walls of fear can fall. God's providence is alive in history and in us. If this story stirred something within you, I invite you to act. Share this video with someone who needs courage today. Comment below. What do you believe made the difference at Ain Jalut? Strategy, leadership, or faith? Your voice might inspire another soul. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to join our growing community where we unite history and Catholic tradition to strengthen our faith together. This week, take time to read Psalm 46. God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Pray it with your family, especially when life feels overwhelming. Remember, God still works through ordinary people, just as he did at Ain Jalut, to bring about extraordinary change. Stand firm. Live faithfully. Trust in him.